Good morning. I'm Carlos Fernandez, policy analyst at the Vegas Chamber. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to the newest federal stimulus package means for Nevada's business webinar with members of our federal lobbying team, Porter Group, and the Vegas Chamber President and CEO, Mayor Beth Sewald. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to explain the features of this call. In order to preserve high sound quality, we'll be muting everyone in the call besides the presenters to make it easier for everyone to hear. If you'd like to ask a question, there are a few ways you can do so. If you join this call on the web or through the mobile app, you can ask a question via the chat feature on the interface. We'll ask your question on your behalf. You can also ask a question by clicking the hand raise button on the interface. We'll call your name and unmute your line so you can ask your question. Once you have asked your question, we'll remute your line so everyone in the call can hear the answer. In order to preserve time, we ask that you please keep questions brief, and we'll be taking all questions at the end of the call. Now please welcome Vegas Chamber's President and CEO, Mayor Beth Sewald.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you everybody for being with us today and for joining us on this Friday. We're so pleased to have you with us. We're also pleased to welcome the Porter Group team with us today as we discuss the newest legislation that they're working on in Washington, D.C. that can potentially help us here in Nevada. The goal, as always, of today's webinar is to really provide employers and employees alike with important information that you need this time about the federal stimulus package and what that means for businesses around Nevada. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers and panelists here in just a moment, but before I do, I would like to take a moment to thank our webinar sponsor, that is SCE Federal Credit Union, and also the UNLV Executive MBA program. Without sponsors like them, we couldn't be providing this great information to you. So we really appreciate their support in helping the Vegas Chamber bring this timely information to you. Also want to highlight just a couple of Vegas Chamber events. We are super excited to be announcing that the Vegas Chamber is partnering once again with our friends at the LVGEA. We're teaming up with them again for our joint Washington, D.C. fly-in, so keep that in mind. The Porter Group is a great partner with our fly-in as well. This year, we're going all virtual and bringing DC to LV. So it's going to be a virtual event, and it'll take place September 14th through the 17th. Of course, as always, we'll have a series of meetings with decision makers on Capitol Hill. We'll be talking with policymakers and, as usual, the Nevada delegation. So now more than ever, we really do need business leaders to engage on these federal issues, especially those that are important to rebuilding our economy and the entire community. And so you can register at vegaschamber.com to join us on the Vegas Chamber's virtual Washington, D.C. fly-in. Also, mark your calendar because on August 19th, on Wednesday, August 19th, from 4:30 to 6:30, we'll be hosting another virtual business after hours. So you definitely don't want to miss that. Lots of fun things happening at the Vegas Chamber. Now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers and friends of the Vegas Chamber, longtime friends, from the Porter Group, who will share their expertise for today's discussion. First up, Mr. Chris Porter. He's the Senior Vice President. Chris Porter, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. We also have Stephanie Walker, Vice President. Stephanie, thank you for being here today. And we have the Director of Public Policy and Legislation, Anna Leieritz. And then Cameron Gresh, who is the Senior Legislative Assistant. Cameron, Anna, Stephanie, and Chris, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. We know that you're all in Washington, D.C., off and on at least, and that's what your backgrounds are telling us right now. So we appreciate you being here. Chris, let's start with you to kind of give us an overall, the 80,000-foot view of what's happening in D.C. with the stimulus package.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you for allowing us to speak today. And hello from DC. I definitely miss the dry heat of Nevada. It's a little muggy and humid back here, so I hope you all enjoy. And I know it's a little hot there, but I take the dry heat over this humidity any day, you know, being born and raised from Vegas. So thank you so much again. You know, we really wanted to bring to you today a good draft outline of what the negotiated packages look like. We were hoping that the self-imposed deadline that the Democrats and the Republicans put on themselves to have at least a draft of what their combined packages look like. Unfortunately, we're still in flux at this moment in time. I mean, there's still time in the day. It's only 1 o'clock back here today. And Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi are going to be meeting with the White House again today at 1:30, so in roughly about 25 minutes. So hopefully those negotiations come out fruitful. Right now, what we're seeing as the sticking points of bringing those packages together is the unemployment details, the SNAP funding, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, child care funding, and educational funding levels. There are a lot of agreements on what needs to be done, but I think a lot of it has to do with funding levels, and that's something that Stephanie's going to go into more detail with you. Again, I would like to thank you again for having us, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to start digging down on what those two packages look like, the HEROES Act, the House Democrats HEROES Act, and the Senate Republican HEALS package.
Thank you, Chris, and I'm looking on my notes as well, so as you see that I'm reading my screen, and it sort of looks like I'm reading you because it looks like I'm looking at you. Don't be alarmed. The Senate HEALS and Senate HEROES Act or House HEROES Act actually have a lot in common, which I found interesting because I feel like there's been a lot of reporting that they are, quote, miles apart on issues. I never found that to be true in reading the legislative texts, but it still is tricky to iron out those details. So let's start with some of the most popular programs, PPP improvements. In the Senate HEALS Act, PPP is expanded and it includes forgivable expenses to include operational expenditures, which was a difference from the CARES Act. It also allows for spending flexibility by extending the 8-week period that you need to spend your money out all the way through 2020 instead of just into fall. It fast tracks loan applications under $2 million, and it expands eligibility to 501c6 organizations, which includes the chamber, so that's wonderful. But it also creates some new stipulations. So it also lowers the max employee threshold to 300 from 500 in CARES, and requires proof of 50% or more lost revenue. No such proof was required in CARES. It does allow for second wave loans for CARES Act recipients, which is also great news. In HEROES, they also allow for flexibility in terms of when that 8-week spending period takes place. It expands eligibility to all 501c nonprofit organizations, which includes 501c6. It also creates eligibility for local broadcasting partners with parent companies similar to other franchise type organizations that do not rely on parent revenue, and it applies that principle across many different parent relationship businesses. So it's a pretty generic ad. It also adds $10 billion to extend the emergency grant program, the EIDL grant program through Treasury. And it has provisions which set aside funds specifically for minority-owned banks to participate as the lending originator. Another key area are the coronavirus relief funds, which is what the state got last time, if you recall. The Senate HEALS Act has no new funding, but it does give a lot more flexibility in how the money can be spent. The HEROES Act has $500 billion for the state, and then $375 billion for direct local government payments, and also creates a lot more flexibility on what those funds can be spent on. The Republicans, the Senate, and the administration have already conceded that they are willing to do $200 billion for state and local funding, but they're still in negotiations on how that's going to shake out. Stimulus checks, both bills have an additional $1,200 individual stimulus check going out. So they both had that. That's probably what will happen. Unemployment, the Senate HEALS Act started out with $200 bonus payment, which is reduced from $600 through October 2020. And then a new algorithm after October 2020, which is a bit complicated, but is not as much of a bonus payment. The House HEROES Act has continues the $600 per week bonus. So this has been a huge sticking point, as Chris said. The Republicans have already agreed to up theirs to $400 instead of $200, and to extend it all the way through 2020, so all the way through December, not just October. That's still not quite good enough for Democrats in terms of their negotiations. So there's been some rumors that they're going to change that to be the full $600 per week bonus, but with an added work requirement. So we'll see how that shakes out. Again, that's a big sticking point, and as you can see or hear, they're not very far off actually. So in terms of being a huge sticking point, I don't think it's as huge as is being said. Hazard pay has been a big thing everyone's talking about. The HEROES Act had $200 billion for employees who were deemed essential as a form of federal hazard pay. The Senate had none of that. I've heard nothing about the negotiations on that. I think that's an issue that has sort of died down actually. So I don't know if that will end up in the final bill. Both bills have an increase to the employee retention tax credit in different ways, but they are they're similar in theory. They're similar in ideology to expand that provision. Paid sick leave, the House HEROES Act has an extension of the paid sick leave provisions from CARES through 2021. The House bill does not extend leave. And then higher education and K-12 education has been a big point of discussion, particularly the Senate HEALS bill has $70 billion for K-12 Title I schools, but 2/3 of that funding is only available for in-person instruction. The funding is also available for private schools, which is a sticking point with the Democrats. The Democrats have $90 billion, which is more money, and it applies to all schools, regardless of virtual or in-person. I do think that in the end, based on comments from Chuck Schumer, that they will come to an agreement where some of the money is designated for in-person schools. I don't think it'll be quite as much as what is there now. Higher education, they both have significant funding for higher ed, except the House wants to put their higher ed funding as part of that $200 billion state and local total. And, I'm sorry, the Senate wants that, the Republicans. And the House would like that to be separate because they just want more money to go toward the education system. They also deal with, the House side, the Democrat side, deal with healthcare issues in a more broad way. They expand some of the ACA provisions and extends increased Medicaid reimbursements. And those are not issues that the House bill dealt with at all, which would mean that the CARES Act provisions would expire. I think some of those issues are ones that are being negotiated as well. I don't think that they will go completely untouched in the new bill. And I think that covers the high level issues that everybody has been following. Liability reform. I can't believe I almost forgot. So the Senate bill has a robust liability reform provision, which essentially for every sector stipulates that if you acted in good faith to follow your local and state health regulations, that you have a liability shelter for if your employees or customers are get COVID. I find, obviously the House bill did not deal with this at all because first of all, I don't think that the issue of liability was as much to the forefront as it is now back during CARES, but also it's something that the Democrats are struggling with a little bit politically because I do think that there is an appetite for liability protections, but they have to be careful to balance that with worker protections. I actually think that what the state of Nevada recently passed on the liability protection side, with the exception of their carve-outs, looks a lot like what's in the federal bill. So that would be helpful because then it's not confusing for businesses. The worker protection side, I think, is where things are a little different. Plus, I know that your state bill had some parameters where if you did not act in good faith, it goes automatically to gross negligence. So it has sort of stricter penalties, which I did not see implemented in the Senate bill. So that's being worked on, and that actually has not been in the media very much. So I think that those negotiations are pretty quiet because I know that it's highly political, particularly for the left. So that's sort of the overview, and I'll hand it over to Cameron, who can dig in a little deeper on some of the key issues like PPP.
Hey, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name's Cameron, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Senator Marco Rubio's S-4321, Continuing Small Business Recovery and Paycheck Protection Program Act. It's important to remember when we talk about heels versus heroes, we're talking about actually a group of about 5 bills that are going to be rolled into one package or perhaps passed separately if that's what Senate leaders decide they'd like to do. That is the name of the portion of the HEALS Act that pertains specifically to the Paycheck Protection Program. Steph went over some of the major differences. I'd like to go ahead and dig in a little deeper. So obviously a really big change here is that we're going to have a whole new class of businesses available to take part in this, 501c6s. It should be noted that HEROES is actually a bit more expansive in its eligibility to include all 501c organizations, but as far as HEALS is concerned specifically, 501c6s like the Vegas Chamber and other trade groups of its type joins 501c3s and 501c19s, which are veteran-owned businesses, as being the 3 eligible entities under the PPP program. The second draw loan is probably the most novel portion of this particular change to the PPP program. What this bill does is it actually rescinds about $100 or so billion left in the PPP funding pot as of this time, and then adds an additional $190 billion with some interesting stipulations on business size and how you can qualify. The biggest one that I'd like to talk about right now is that at least $25 billion of this newly appropriated $190 billion would be set aside for entities with 10 or fewer employees as of February 15th of this year. $10 billion of that money would also need to be issued by small community financial institutions with less than $10 billion in assets. So that's just a fancy way of saying that the SBA is clearly trying to make their funding streams much more accessible. I don't know what the experiences were of some of the individuals and business owners on this call, but I can tell you that access to PPP in the early days, in those crazy days when it was being rolled out, were largely determined by your bank's ability to handle it. And that was obviously not the same across the board. And it unfortunately had the effect of kind of chilling PPP usage in certain areas of the country where small banks simply were overwhelmed and couldn't handle it. So this is kind of a way to go ahead and at least mitigate that a little bit. I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about the funding size that you might get here. If you are going for a second round, meaning that you've already received a first round of PPP under the old rules, you'd now like to go ahead and get a second draw, you couldn't get more than 250% of your average monthly payroll cost, or $2 million, whichever comes first. That would be compared to the time last year versus the time you're applying for the loan now. So let's say you apply in September of 2020, your revenue streams would be compared to September 2019 revenue streams. The approved spending for the funds that you do receive under a second or first draw loan, this section applies to either kind of entity, are a little bit different. You still have that 60% mandatory payroll usage if you want to qualify for the forgiveness. So that hasn't changed. However, what you can spend that remaining 40% on has changed a lot. There are some new things here that are certainly reflective of recent events I'd like to quickly go over. Underneath the new $190 billion PPP second draw loans, you'd be able to spend your remaining 40% that wasn't spent on payroll on things like software or cloud computing services to facilitate your business's product delivery, payroll expenses, or simply working remotely. Obviously, that's all the rage now. If your business had to invest in some kind of technology in order to make that happen, PPP wants to help you out. If you had costs related to property damage, vandalism, or looting due to public disturbances at any point in 2020 and that damage wasn't covered by insurance, your 40% remainder PPP could also be used for that. Payments made to suppliers of essential goods under contracts in effect before February 15th, meaning that items that your business bought as part of its normal procedures that it now may have trouble getting rid of if you are like a retail environment or something like that, would also be eligible underneath this 40% new tranche of funding. Personal protective equipment for employees is probably one of the biggest and most common new expenditures that you would be able to authorize under the new PPP funding. Obviously, masks, gloves, cleaning supplies, all those things are definitely covered, and you might even see these kinds of things and other pieces of legislation that were designed to actually alleviate some of the costs of this kind of stuff to businesses, as it probably represents a significant expenditure for pretty much any business of any type, no matter what you're doing, if you are still operate a physical location. Which brings me to my last new expenditure for the PPP second draw loans, and that would be probably one of the other most costly, would be adaptations such as drive-through windows, ventilation systems, plexiglass sneeze guards, screening capabilities, all that stuff. Businesses, I'm sure everyone on this phone call understands, if you've been to like a bank or a grocery store recently, you might have seen some new plexiglass or cleaning supplies or something like that. That all would also be covered underneath the new PPP loans, which were not before. Again, these costs do not factor into your total forgivable loan amount, but if you are less than 40%, it's definitely something you're going to want to take a look at. However, I want to be clear here, you still need to spend that 60% on payroll if you want it to be forgivable. And that's pretty much all there is new regarding the PPP. If you have not participated in PPP yet, you still can. But unfortunately, you wouldn't be getting the maximum $10 million that was initially authorized under CARES. Your new maximum loan would be reduced to $2 million. So your total first and second draw combined loan amount, if you haven't taken PPP already, would be for no more than $4 million, or $2 million plus 250% of your average monthly revenue compared to this time last year. One other thing I'd like to go over is a relatively new and kind of mysterious program that would be authorized under this part of the HEALS Act that was not in HEROES. This is a completely new creation under the HEALS Act. It's called the Recovery Sector Loan Program. This is authorized out of the SBA's traditional 7A business loan program that the PPP also is a part of. We've got about $100 billion authorized here for this. And it's designed to serve seasonal businesses and businesses in low-income census tracts. And these two entities combine to form a class of businesses that SBA feels have not been able to take full advantage of the PPP. One thing that Steph mentioned, I'd like to go ahead and remind everyone at this juncture, is that EIDL is not talked about at all under HEROES. So this is probably not maybe necessarily to replace that, but definitely kind of a last ditch effort. If I've just spoken to you for 20 minutes here or whatever, and you aren't eligible for PPP at all, this is something I want you to take a look at. You'd be eligible for about $1 to $10 million, but I want to be clear here, this is a loan. There is no forgiveness of any kind underneath this program. However, they do offer pretty, I think, good terms. Maximum loans would be $10 million or 200% of average annual revenue for your business, whichever is less. They'd have a maturity of 20 years and a 1% interest rate. Payments of principal and interest would be deferred for at least 2 years. So certainly not forgivable, but designed to be taken advantage of, I think, quite easily. But if you do qualify for PPP at any point in this in your application, after 90 days of application to this program, you would be able to get it. You just wouldn't get more than $1 million. So this doesn't mutually exclude you from taking advantage of PPP. It's just something that the SBA is assuming you're looking at if you don't qualify. But if you do, you still can use it. You just won't get more than $1 million out of PPP. Your business, a seasonal business, is any business that isn't in operation for more than 7 months out of the year. And your business, for the low income portion of this, would have to be located in what the U.S. government deems a low-income census tract. You would also have to represent about 50% revenue losses between, I believe, now and last year. It could also be 2020 as a whole, but I believe it's compared to a point in time, just like PPP. That's basically the long and short of this totally new and not a terribly fleshed out program, but it's definitely in there, and I want everyone to know about it, because just like PPP and EIDL were kind of like twins for businesses that were struggling in the early days of COVID, the Recovery Sector Loan Program is going to be probably the only other option you may have if you don't qualify for PPP. So that's just something I wanted everyone to know about here. Other than that, there are some other small, tiny differences. Obviously 501(c) organizations that receive 10% or less of their revenue from lobbying or employ 300 or fewer people is kind of the background information of that. So if you heard 501(c)(6), make sure you also meet those requirements as well. It would bar the use of first or second PPP funds for lobbying activities defined under the Lobbying Disclosures Act. It would allow PPP borrowers to decide whether they want their loan forgiveness period to cover costs incurred over 8 weeks or through December 31st, Steph mentioned this. It's something I want to bring up again because many businesses did express issues with getting all that money out the door in the time frame that SBA initially mandated. This seeks to mitigate that. That was a common complaint that I want everybody to know about. There's also a bit of the liability safe harbor that Steph talked about. That absolutely applies here. If you were acting in good faith, based on information and certification and documentation and guidance you had at the time regarding COVID-19, you are more or less shielded from most kinds of lawsuits up to 2024, I believe. October 2024 is the main date to remember there. Other than that, if you are a very small business and you're getting a pretty comparatively small PPP loan, your application process will be greatly simplified to the point where you would have to provide very few actual forms of documentation. This is going to seek to go ahead and lower that application time that some business owners said was difficult and confusing. SBA clearly has heard you, and Senator Rubio has as well, and he wrote that into the bill specifically to kind of make that a little bit easier. If you are an agricultural business or a farmer or ranching business, there's a special formula to calculate loans for certain entities within that range under the first round of PPP funding. If anyone has any questions on that, I won't get into it now, but please let me know. I can help you there. And other than that, it would clarify the approved PPP payroll costs included in employer-provided group insurance benefits. That was also something that was a bit confusing from last time. Again, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but if you have questions, please let me know. And that's pretty much it. Recovery sector loans are new and not as well understood. It is very likely we're going to have some serious guidance coming out if that program were to make it into law as it is now. Just like with PPP, these things are written hastily and then guidance is built upon over a period of months after enactment. I can tell you right now that the PPP program is set to lapse tomorrow. Outside of any deal, we'd be looking at probably a 2-week turnaround time from anything that is signed into law, meaning that, let's say, for instance, something was signed into law on August 10th. You would be waiting 2 weeks after that probably to be able to apply for PPP loans again. This is not a hard and fast rule, more of a general guideline, but it's something I wanted everyone to know. If you are chomping at the bit to apply for PPP after hearing all of this, you are going to have to wait probably the whole month of August, maybe just 2 weeks, but it really depends on what lawmakers are able to agree on. And that's pretty much the long and short of it. I'm available for questions if anyone has any other outlying stuff. I know this is really dense, but that's everything I want to get into the weeds on today as I think it affects Nevada business owners. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Anna Leieritz, for the rest of our briefing today.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. That was a really great overview. Good morning, good afternoon. Everybody's kind of gone over a lot of nitty gritty about what's in these pieces of legislation. And I did want to remind everybody that this is not agreed upon yet. This is an active and ongoing negotiation between the two chambers and the White House. They're debating at all hours of the day right now. I've talked to a number of folks on the Hill, just kind of asking where they thought things were, what they thought was sticking, what maybe are points that are going to be given up during all of this. And the consensus seems to be with everybody that the child care portions of this, the state and local funding portions of this, the small business PPP, EIDL loans, these are going to be very important pieces in this. Surprisingly, I've heard that Stephanie talked a little bit about the liability protections, and that may be something that is negotiated a little more than we had expected. I think like Nevada has done, a lot of states have worked on that internally, and it's become more of a state-by-state case, working on the liability protections. And so that may be something that is not part of the larger package. A lot of my folks are saying that we're still miles apart on these pieces of legislation, where we're not getting any closer to a deal. And unfortunately, that means, as Cameron was saying, we can't apply for these loans right now because nothing has been agreed to yet. And so it's going to wait. It's going to be until things are passed and they are agreed to that we're able to start applying for these loans and this eligibility. But, that being said, the president has mentioned that he's planning to sign some executive orders to try to get some of these things in place. We have heard that could be as soon as this evening that he signed some of these pieces of legislation, since this executive order. So we may be seeing some of that sooner rather than later. If that were to happen, we may not even end up seeing more negotiating on the Hill. That may be the end. We may just have the president signing his executive orders, and then we move on and see how that shakes out. As far as right this very moment, they are still negotiating. it's still a mess. It's unfortunately that's you know how things tend to be here in DC. I've had folks even telling me that this, because it has been such a disaster in the negotiating standpoints, that it could have some leadership ramifications. Some folks are saying they've not been happy with the way things are being negotiated, especially within the way the Republican conference is handling it. And so I think there could be some leadership shakeup if things do not turn out the way things are hoping for folks on both ends of the spectrum. But I thought that was an interesting tidbit that somebody told me that there could be some leadership ramifications. Personally, I feel like that may be more like a Liz Cheney sort of a situation rather than like Mitch McConnell. But that's just speculation. We will see. But this is still an active and ongoing negotiation. And we will continue to be monitoring this and letting you guys know as we're hearing of things. But as Chris said when we first started, we were really hoping that we would have a passed final version of this bill before we chatted with you guys today. But we're just not there yet. So we're going to continue watching it. And we're going to continue monitoring it for you guys. But as far as I know, I think we're ready to take questions if anybody has anything.
Yeah, we do. Well, thank you guys so much. You are all just so knowledgeable. And Cameron, I've known you since you were born. And so it's fun to watch you. Your knowledge is just incredible. And so to all of you, you're just amazing and we appreciate it. We are getting some questions. This one's for Anna. If negotiations don't move forward, could the president issue an executive order on limited liability?
That is a great question. I believe that the liability protections, if they are not agreed upon, are going to end up in a state-by-state, passed on a state-by-state basis. Does anybody else have a better answer to that? Steph, Cameron, Chris?
So I would say that the answer has to be no, because liability as it stands today is defined absolutely in statute. There's very few circumstances. I cannot think of a circumstance where liability is defined by guidance, with maybe the exception actually of fiduciary standards. So there might be some precedent for administrative action on liability, but very limited. So I would say that the answer is no, he cannot do that. The things that he can do by executive order, he could extend the eviction delay through HUD-owned properties because HUD already has that authority. He could probably do something with K-12 and higher education funding through Department of Education, because I am certain that the CARES Act gave a lot of authority already to the secretary for that. They might be able to do something with the current PPP loans with the funding that they have. And it's possible that they could do a stimulus check, but it would be quite limited. There's not much that he could do, except I will say that often administrations make executive orders and then you have to challenge them if they don't have the authority. Sometimes they just do stuff they don't have the authority to do, and it takes a challenge to stop them. If there's no challenge, it's not stopped.
It's also important to remember that an executive order is very easily turned over, like you were saying, by a challenge, but also if a new president were to come in, that is something they can immediately turn over within another executive order. And so it doesn't carry the full weight of a piece of legislation that's passed. It would be a lot easier to do away with than, for instance, than passing a large piece of legislation. But it does get a quicker fix. So some of the expiring provisions could be taken care of immediately in something like this.
Okay, and we have a clarifying question from one of our guests. It says, are they discussing reallocating Main Street Loan Program funds, or will that program remain? If it will remain, is there someone we can discuss the program with? I believe there has only been one funded in the entire country. We would be happy to share why.
Well, I can go ahead and speak a little bit to that. The Main Street program is the oft forgotten, stepchild of the kind of Federal Reserve's response to the pandemic. I can tell you, I was calling around trying to find banks that even knew about it when it was rolled out, sometime I think in early June. You're right, this program isn't very well understood or utilized. I don't see anything on first pass that eliminates or alters the Main Street program fundamentally in any way. However, I know that the business community was very lukewarm about it when it first came out because some of the requirements were weirdly strict and kind of difficult to understand. Unfortunately, I don't see anything in the HEALS Act right now that serves to clarify that at all, unfortunately. However, I will go back and do a more thorough search. I'm going to make sure my contact information is available to anyone here. If you have a question that didn't get answered today, please let me know. I'll do my best. But unfortunately, all I have on that right now is that if you were struggling to get a Main Street Loan program before, unfortunately, I don't think this legislation is going to do anything to help you. But one point I would like to make very quickly is that the Main Street program has a nonprofit twin brother that was born, I think, sometime in July. It's live now. It's got a lot of the same rules, but it basically makes it if that you're kind of a mid to large size nonprofit, you can go ahead and take advantage of a very, very sizable and kindly written federal loan. Again, if the application process is too dense or difficult, you don't qualify. Unfortunately, you'll see no help here. But I wanted to go ahead and just throw that in really quick because even less people know about the nonprofit section of the Main Street Loan program.
Yeah. Okay. This one might be another question for you, Cameron. It's a clarifying question. Did you say that they will be including employer paid benefits in second round of PPP? We are a union company and 45% of our payroll costs go towards employee benefits. So this would be a huge win for us.
Oh, I was muted there. I apologize. I did also attempt to put that in the chat, but I may not be up on my Zoom, so that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and say it here in case anybody else didn't read that. Yes, approved PPP payroll costs, do cover employer-provided group insurance benefits. Now, as far as being a union company or anything like that, I'm happy to get into the weeds with you more on your specific business and go through the legislation with you one-on-one if that would help to make sure, because there are always caveats to this, but yes, by and large speaking, that is an approved PPP payroll cost under the HEALS Act, which again, as Anna said, right now is all theoretical, but we're very much hoping these provisions make it through. I'm glad to hear that it would help your business, and I welcome any more specific questions, either here or offline, if you require further assistance.
Okay. All right. Very good. And then you all know that the Vegas Chamber recently, and Stephanie, you brought this up a few minutes ago when you were talking about limited liability. The Vegas Chamber was heavily involved in advocating on behalf of businesses for limited liability protection in Nevada. We were very disappointed that hospitals and education were not included in that. And I know you touched on this, but can you give us just a little bit more clarity around what the federal side might look like? You said it would be a sort of similar to what we passed in Nevada.
Well, as Anna said, it's up in the air because now that states are acting on their own, it's possible that the feds will wash their hands of it because they like to do that anytime something is controversial. If you don't have to deal with it, don't, right? However, if they do keep something, as it stands right now in HEALS, there's a very similar good faith effort principle that was applied in the state law that it is applied in the HEALS Act. That applies only to the protection side because your state protection side applies to employees, but not to workers' comp, which is comparable to the federal bill. And it stipulates that significant effort means the legal term is good faith effort, and I can expand on that, which is actually, I would say, a pretty lenient principle, which is, I think, pretty positive. The difference is that your state bill, and I won't get too much into it because I'm not an expert on your state level policy. Paul Murad can get more into it. Your state bill had some penalties that were associated with not making good faith efforts. So if someone with whatever burden of proof standard was set can say you did not make a good faith effort, it goes immediately to gross negligence, which is a much stronger case than regular negligence. And then also the federal bill currently does not deal with anything related to worker protections, which if there is a deal, there definitely will be an element of worker protections. And I don't know exactly what they'll look like, but certainly there's no way that the Democrats will agree to a liability bill without set worker protection parameters. Now, I did mention before we started the call, just offhand to Mary Beth, that where there's a K-12 carve out in the Nevada state bill, if the federal government chooses to do any carve out, I would not be surprised if it was a K-12 carve out because there's been, I think everyone has seen a real national conversation around teacher safety as we all go back to school. And the teachers union is nationwide, and they have a very energetic presence. One of the strongest advocates, lobbyists, self-advocates in DC. So if they would like to be exempted from liability protections, I imagine that if a carve out was given, it would be given to them, unless the worker protection parameters of the bill were to their satisfaction. So I know that's all a lot speculation there. That's just my take on how it might come out. So I don't know if it totally answers your question. It's a bit of a crystal ball read, but.
Yeah, no, and it all is right now, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. Let's see, I'm getting some comments in the chat. So you're completely accurate from Mr. Guidry. So anyway, all right, very good. So Chris Porter, here's a question kind of for you, and this is about funding for local and state governments. I know we all kind of touched on that a little bit earlier about which HEALS or HEROES did or did not have any funding. Of course, one of the notable differences between the two bills is that the Senate bill does not provide any funding for state and local governments, and the House bill does, if I'm correct. Why do you think that is, and do you think that'll change, or is it going to stay that way?
Well, we initially, and I think still believe that they're using it as a negotiation tool. The Republicans and Democrats are. That's why Democrats' bill really heavily funded state and local funding. And there's some give and take there, as you guys know, when it comes to things happening in DC, which is happening right now, of course. So we.
Oh, I think
Chris Rose.
in. Well,
Until we get Chris back, you guys somebody else pick up where he left off?
Well, I think what he's saying is what we've been saying is that these negotiations are ongoing. So, I mean, Anna said they keep saying they're miles apart, and it's something that I really scoff at. And I'll just be frank with all of you that I just don't think that that's true. If you look at the legislation and what we've presented here today, I would say that they are emotionally a mile apart on things that are actually 1 inch long, and actually ideologically and theoretically speaking, they have a lot of agreement. I mean, they've already all agreed to expand unemployment. They've all agreed to do an additional stimulus check. They've all agreed to hundreds of billions of dollars for state and local funding. They've all agreed that they want kids to go back to school, but they want it to be safe. I feel like the principles are all agreed to, and we're really just in the very narrow weeds here on this mile apart notion. So I don't know if you have more say on that, Anna.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think everybody's saying they're miles apart. It is exactly what you just said. It's more emotionally, and politically we're miles apart. I think when you get down to the nitty gritty and the pen to paper, they're a lot closer than we think. They're having a hard time with anybody having any sort of give and take. And we have to remember this is an election year. It's a really tough election year. And so a lot of folks are really, really gunning for a win. A lot of folks want to win. And I think it's going to be, everybody wants to win. And what that win looks like to everybody may be slightly different. And so that's why everybody's kind of sticking their heels in on what they want. We are starting to see some programs expire right now. And so I think we're starting to see some trickle down effects from that. And so it may be that when we start getting some things done, it may make a bigger difference and may be more important for a little more give and take as the programs start expiring, like PPP. I think Cameron said expires tomorrow. So we'll hopefully get a little more done there.
Okay, sounds good. And you guys probably were monitoring the governor's press conference yesterday, where he announced Barbara Buckley and Lisa Cafferata overseeing the unemployment issues that we've had with Dieter here in the state of Nevada. So since the PUA unemployment benefits have expired, how long do you all think it will take to restart the system, since the Treasury has to reauthorize those regulations and rules?
Glad you brought this up, because we did not mention that both bills include money to deal with the technical and administrative problems that the states have been having with this huge overload of unemployment claims. including security issues that not just Nevada has faced. So there is money in both versions, so I expect that to exist. And then I'll hand it over to Cameron to answer about the length of time that the guidance might take.
Yeah, that definitely falls under what I said earlier about the 2-week minimum probably turnaround time. But again, I want to be very clear, that is not written in law. That is just simply kind of how it generally works out when the government has to quickly turn a program around. It could be longer, and if by some miracle, it could be even shorter if the extra money that Steph just talked about does its job and helps assist some of the administrative issues we were having earlier. But generally speaking, 2 weeks from when the president signs the bill is usually the soonest you would be able to take advantage of anything written into the HEALS Act, unless outside of very special or expedited circumstances, which could very well occur, but 2 weeks is my personal timeline, and generally that's how it works out.
Okay, sounds good. It looks like we might have Chris Porter back. Chris, did you want to finish up where you left off, or pick up where you left off?
Sure. I don't know what of course the rest of the team said, but as a negotiation tool is kind of where I was with that. I think it was a foregone conclusion that there is going to be some state and local funding in there in the completed bill that both sides agree upon. So I again think it was as a negotiation tool, a little give and take there, especially when liability protections at the time was very high on the list for Republicans. And if everyone remembers, Senate Majority Leader said that they're not going to do anything without some form of liability protection in the next package.
Okay, sounds good. And I
Though
know
it's worth noting that in negotiations, Senator McConnell does not seem to have been present, actually, which is some inside ball. That the two Democrats representing Democrats in both the House and Senate are Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer. Makes sense. The two Republicans in the negotiation are Steve Mnuchin and Mark Meadows from the White House. So I don't know if Mitch McConnell's priority there is going to make it. That's for them to say, I guess.
It's been interesting that the Senate Republicans have had so many opinions, but they have not been present at the negotiating table. They've left it all to the White House. I think that is kind of telling.
Very. Okay, and then Cameron, you were talking about the time frame for which people might be able to take advantage of the PPP and so forth. Do you have any idea if, for example, if it's a 2-week gap or what have you, would that be retroactive for unemployment?
Honestly, I don't think, Mary Beth, I can answer that intelligently, only because that would simply be a guess at this point. That would be something that I could inquire about with both the state and maybe get some federal guidance on that as well. But I would hesitate to assign any kind of timeline to something like that right now, just because, as you all know, it is very much up in the air. But I can absolutely look into that for any panel, or members of the call that are interested. But unfortunately, I can't speak intelligently to that right now. You could be correct, but it could easily just as not be.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Cameron. All right, I appreciate everybody's expertise today. You guys clearly have your finger on the pulse of everything that's happening, and your support and advocacy for the chamber and our members and the business community in general across the entire state of Nevada is so appreciated, and we just can't tell you how much it means to all of us to have you as our right hand in Washington, D.C., helping us at the Vegas Chamber look out for all of our members and all of the business community across the state. So with that, does anybody have any sort of closing remarks or final thoughts or anything that we didn't get to in today's call?
Yeah, I did just want to say that Congressman Porter and the team have been meeting with our delegation quite a bit. And we are very thankful to have a delegation like we do that has gone to bat for you guys pretty significantly. Every single one of our members in one way or another supported the 501c6 add to the PPP, as well as significant tourism priorities, which unfortunately has been a huge uphill battle for them to try and get into any kind of legislation. But I can tell you that some of these provisions that our folks are fighting for, and we only have one Republican, are not things that are commonly popular with their conference. So they have broken from rank in order to support you, particularly our two senators, Senators Cortez Masto and Senator Rosen. And I think that that is really telling to your relationship with them, as well as their true support of the region. But it's not limited to those two. All of our House members also came out in support for all of your issues, including robust tourism packages that they're still fighting for.
I would agree with you, Stephanie, and give them kudos as well. The Vegas Chamber has regular conversations with all of the Nevada delegation. They're always extremely accessible, and they're interested in being educated on the concerns of our businesses, large and small. And also they've been supportive of all the chambers across the state in our efforts in trying to secure PPP funding for C6s, which we desperately need, because as you guys know, all the chambers across the state are doing everything we possibly can to assist our businesses, members or not. And you know, we're kind of in a similar boat with finances, so it'll be incredibly helpful, and we appreciate their assistance on that front as well. So, all right, well, thank you guys all again. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. We know your time is valuable. I also want to thank our webinar sponsors today, SCE Federal Credit Union, along with the UNLV Executive MBA program. We appreciate everybody's support. You guys stay safe out there, wear those face coverings, mask up for Nevada, and I'm sure we'll be talking very soon. And everybody on the call today, thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
weekend.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Bye.
Bye.